In this video, I will tell you why it is impossible to alleviate poverty. We have been told that development is effective, that poverty has decreased by half over the last 3 decades, and it will disappear by 2030, with the global south finally catching up to the north. The most influential government and businesses in the world supporting this reassuring story. However, is it accurate? The extent of income disparity between the North and South has nearly tripled since 1960. 60% of world's population, or 4.3 billion, survive on less than $5 a day. 1 billion people depend on less than $1 a day. The wealthiest 8 individuals currently possess the same amount of wealth as the whole poorest of the half. Now let's trace the origin of these grand narratives of development and poverty reduction. In 1948, Harry Truman was elected as President of the United States. He was to deliver his inaugural speech on January 20th, 1949, and his speech writers were busy in announcing new gimmicks. They had 3 ideas on the list: begging for the new United Nations, resistance to the Soviet threat, and continued commitment to Marshall Plan. They needed something inspirational, which was provided by Benjamin Hardy. As a youthful intermediate level official in the State Department, Hardy possessed a flair for crafting an attention-grabbing headline from his days as an Atlanta Journal writer. As soon as he discovered a memo asking for new concept for the inaugural speech, he made the decision to submit his boss an absurd notion: development. Would Truman not declare that his administration would provide third world nations with aid in their development and eradicate the plague of impoverishment without end? In decades, United States spent billions of dollars on uplifting the poor countries. Development has been a remarkable accomplishment in the eyes of its proponent, improving things like maternal and child mortality and bringing us closer to a future free of poverty. Indeed, there has been a number of noteworthy successes. For instance, fewer children died from avoidable causes, from 17 million in the 1990 to fewer than 8 million in 2013. Additionally, throughout the same time frame, there has been a 47% decrease in the chance of women dying during giving birth. These figures are noteworthy. But on the other hand, there were an estimated 460 million people on the planet during 1970s, but rather than giving away, hunger only grew worse. Even by the most conservative estimates, there are around 800 million hungry people in the world today. More accurate estimates place the number at about 2 billion, or almost 1/3 of the world's total population. One of the biggest gimmicks of development was giving aid to the poor countries. The poor countries receive 128 billion in aid each year. Many of the leading economists are of the view that by giving aid to the poor countries, the poverty can be eliminated. The American economist Jeffrey Sachs, the former director of Millennial Development Goals and special advisor to UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, is among these economists. A pleasant and attractive change from the traditional technocrats, Sachs has become a type of rock celebrity and our era's aid missionary, earning 2 spots on Time's list of the 100 most influential people in the world. His best-selling book from 2005, The End of Poverty, presented a clear-cut case. He asserted that no one is to blame for the persistent poverty of the developing nations. The only thing preventing it are climate and geographic anomalies, which are easily remedied. Rich nations' donation to overseas aid should be increased to 0.7% of GDP, which would be a great start. We would be able to eradicate global poverty in only 20 years. According to these groundbreaking predictions, we are almost there. But is there any poverty reduction on the horizon? The answer is no. Grandiose illusions have been debunked by a number of studies. For example, Global Financial Integrity and the Center for Applied Research at Norwegian School of Economics published a data which sent shockwaves across the developmental sphere. Their data discovered that including all foreign aid, investments and revenue, developing nations received a little over $2 trillion in 2012. However, in the same year, more than twice that amount, roughly $5 trillion, flew out of them. Stated differently, developing nations sent $3 trillion more to the global community than what they received. This net outflow of funds, if we include all of the years since 1980s, comes to an astounding $26.5 trillion. Over the last few decades, a staggering amount of money has been taken out of the global south. The GDP of the United States and the Western Europe combined is approximately $26.5 trillion, to give you an idea of this magnitude. So what makes these massive outflows? Well, paying off debts is a portion of it. These days, developing nations pay foreign creditors more than $200 billion in interest alone annually. The majority of these payments are from old, heavily amortized loans, while others are from loans taken out by dictators. Developing nations have paid over $4.2 trillion in interest since 1980s, a substantial amount more than they have in aid over the same time frame. The majority of these payments have been sent directly to large banks in New York and London, who are Western creditors. There are also numerous smaller outflows, such as additional $60 billion that developing nations have to pay to foreign patent holders annually under the WTO's Intellectual Property Rights Agreement in order to obtain access to drugs and technology, which are frequently necessary for public health and development. While big pharmaceutical companies in the north are involved in biopiracy. Biopiracy is defined as the unauthorized extraction of biological resources, and our associated traditional knowledge from developing countries are the patenting of spurious inventions based on such knowledge or resources without compensation. In other words, the companies of global north are involved in stealing intellectual property from the global south. Roughly 29,000 herbal substances, or at least the raw material, are derived from biodiversity rich nations in Asia, Africa and South America. These substances are employed by over 1,000 enterprises with annual revenues exceeding $60 billion. If more than 200 billions are paid in interest alone, then why not defaulting on debts? If the debt has been defaulted on, the international banks would have been forced to take on the consequences of their reckless spending, freeing the global south from their sway. However, in practice, this was not an option because defaulting countries would always face the danger of US military invasion. The governments of the global south understood from the experience of Iran, Guatemala, the Congo and Chile that jeopardizing Washington's economic interest or even the interest of the large US bank would open the door to the prospect of a coup supported by US. This was always a very real threat. The developing nations were forced to allow Washington revolution. To understand the consequences of going against Washington consensus, we have to look back into the history. Muhammad Mossadegh was elected Prime Minister of Iran in 1952. During his tenure as a Prime Minister, he instituted benefit for the sick and injured workers and employment compensation. He outlawed forced labor in agriculture. To pay for initiatives related to rural development, he increased taxes on wealthy. Most notably, he attempted to renegotiate who owned the nation's oil reserve, which were then under the British-owned Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, now known as British Petroleum. The Iranian parliament unanimously decided to nationalize the company's asset after the businesses refused to comply with an audit of its financial statement. British asked US for assistance in overthrowing Mossadegh. Military intervention was on the table, but it was rejected because it might provoke USSR into coming to Iran's assistance. To start, they paid to protesters to turn out in the street and bought politicians to incite anti-government sentiment in order to give the false impression that Mossadegh was unpopular. Next day, they persuaded the armed forces to remove Mossadegh and transfer authority to Muhammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran. It was successful. Mossadegh was overthrown by a coup in August 1953, and Shah came to rule as an absolute monarch under the military regime. After the overthrow of Mossadegh, Guatemalan President Jacobo Arbenz was the next. Jacobo Arbenz was democratically elected president of Guatemala in 1951. At the time, fewer than 3% of Guatemalans owned 70% of the land. Large areas of private land were to be nationalized by Arbenz and given to landless peasants who had been enslaved by debt during the previous years, so they might cultivate their way out of famine. Interestingly, the United Fruit Company, a US company, owned around 450,000 acres of designated territory. The corporation declined to comply even after being promised full compensation. Rather, they used Cold War rhetoric to rally popular support in the US and pressured the US government to topple Arbenz, portraying Guatemala as a Soviet satellite and Arbenz as a Russian stooge. Under the leadership of Dulles, who spent 38 years for working for United Fruit Company, and his brother, the CIA was pleased to comply. They toppled his government and installed a military dictator. In the following decades, US intervened directly or indirectly in Democratic Republic of Congo, Chile, and others to topple the progressive governments and install military dictators. Now let's talk about IMF and World Bank. In 1944, during the final stages of World War II, in the Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, two institutions were created, namely International Monetary Fund and World Bank. The World Bank would finance reconstruction and development across war-torn Europe, and the IMF would finance state spending in countries experiencing economic slumps to ensure that low demand in one nation wouldn't trigger a crisis across the region. During the 70s and 60s, this worked quite well, although inequality still prevailed, but much less than what was about to follow. IMF was initially intended to lend money using its own funds to nations experiencing balance of payments issues, enabling them to maintain public spending and avert another Great Depression. However, the G7 in the coming years used the IMF for quite a different objective, compelling nations in the global south to cease spending on the governments and the use proceeds to pay back loan to Western banks. To put it another way, the IMF was created to serve as a global debt collector. Following the footsteps of IMF, World Bank was not behind in the reinforcement of existing inequalities. The phrase "our dream is a world free of poverty" is displayed prominently in the lobby of World Bank's headquarters in the Washington, D.C. This motto appears next to the logo on all of the World Bank's key publications. And for its part, IMF's official goal is to lessen economic instability. How therefore do we explain the bank's and IMF's continued pursuit of policies that seems to exacerbate both economic instability and poverty, given their professed commitment to reducing instability and poverty? The list of the World Bank's president. Eugene Meyer was the chairman of Federal Reserve. John McCloy was the U.S. Assistant Secretary of War. Eugene Blake was bank executive with Chase. George Wood was a bank executive with First Boston Corporation. Robert McNamara was U.S. Secretary of Defense and executive of Ford Motor Company. Eldon Clausen was a bank executive with Bank of America. Barbara Conable was a U.S. congressman. Lewis Preston was a bank executive with J.P. Morgan. James Wolfenson was a corporate lawyer and banker. Paul Wolfowitz was U.S. Deputy Secretary of Defense. Robert Zoellick was a Deputy Secretary of State and U.S. Trade Representative. One thing is common among all these is that none of them have any expertise in development. From this perspective, it makes sense that the past presidents of World Bank have all been the U.S. Army bosses are Wall Street executives with a strategic interest in America's place in the world economy, rather than developing expert as one might expect from an organization dedicated to development and fight against poverty. Summing up, I will say that the roots of global inequality lie in the historical process of colonization, exploitation, and coercion by Western powers. The global North's wealth is directly linked to the impoverishment of global South, a legacy that continues through the contemporary economic policies, such as debt repayments, trade agreements, and the actions of international financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank. I will end this video by sharing few lines from Jason Hickel's book, Divide. What is causing this growing divide? We are told that poverty is a natural phenomenon that can be fixed with aid, but in reality, it is a political problem. Poverty does not just exist, it has been created. Poor countries are poor because they are integrated into a global economic system on unequal terms. Aid only works to hide the deep pattern of wealth extraction that causes poverty and inequality in the first place. Rigged trade deals, tax evasion, land grabs, and the cost associated with climate change. The divide tracks the evolution of this system from the expedition of Christopher Columbus in the 1490s to the international debt regimes, which has allowed a handful of rich countries to effectively control economic policies in the rest of the world. So, is it possible to alleviate poverty amid the ongoing incursion of IMF and World Bank? The answer is up to you. Personally, I don't think so. That's why I have chosen the title, Why It Is Impossible to Alleviate Poverty. Thank you.